The introduction of the clone army in Star Wars presented a moment of ideological contradiction that the narrative of the prequel era rarely interrogated directly. When the Jedi accepted command of the clones, they did so under the assumption that the survival of the Republic required immediate military action. The cinematic framing of their first deployment emphasized urgency, coordination, and strategic necessity. But beneath that surface lay an institutional decision that undermined the fundamental principles the Order claimed to uphold. The spectacle of armoured troops supporting robed generals masked the ethical disparity created by the sudden incorporation of an engineered army that the Jedi neither commissioned nor evaluated. This dissonance formed the thematic foundation of the conflict, revealing that the Jedi entered the war without assessing the moral cost of relying on manufactured soldiers bred for compliance. The Jedi's failure to interrogate the origin of the clones reflected a broader structural weakness within the Order. Their acceptance of the army occurred without public inquiry, internal debate, or philosophical deliberation. The lack of questioning suggested a withdrawal from their historical role as mediators and moral arbiters. Instead of challenging the ethics of mass-produced soldiers, the Jedi treated the clones as a resource, delivered at the exact moment the Republic required military capability. This absence of scrutiny revealed how the Order had drifted from reflective practice toward bureaucratic obedience, operating within the political framework of the Republic rather than evaluating its demands. The clones, therefore, entered the war not as individuals with rights or autonomy, but as instruments folded into a system that prioritized utility over humanity. Operational behavior during the Clone Wars reinforced this pattern. Field engagements depicted Jedi issuing orders without acknowledging the implications of commanding genetically standardized soldiers whose identities were shaped by artificial conditioning. While many Jedi demonstrated concern for casualties and individual troopers, their behavior rarely included critical examination of the clones' lack of agency in participating in the war. The Jedi used language derived from military hierarchy, referring to clones through ranks, designations, or tactical assignments rather than through personhood. This reinforced the perception that clones existed for operational efficiency rather than for self-determined purpose. Even when Jedi expressed gratitude or camaraderie, their recognition did not extend to questioning the system that defined clone existence. The emotional and psychological strain experienced by the clones revealed another dimension of the Jedi's institutional oversight. The clones operated within extreme conditions involving accelerated aging, ongoing combat exposure, and constant proximity to loss. These factors produced psychological burdens that the Jedi were not equipped to understand due to their prohibition against attachment and their limited frameworks for processing grief. As a result, the Jedi lacked the tools to recognize patterns of trauma among their troops. The Order's teaching centered on detachment and internal equilibrium, leaving them unable to comprehend the depth of interpersonal bonds that formed among clones or the mental toll of continuous conflict. This disconnect created an environment where clones carried emotional weight without acknowledgement or structural support. The absence of long-term planning further demonstrated the Order's failure to consider the clones' future beyond immediate military need. Decisions made by the Jedi Council focused on tactical objectives and strategic positioning rather than on the post-war conditions of the soldiers under their command. No policies were discussed regarding clone rights, integration into civilian life, or recognition of service. The Jedi assumed that once the conflict resolved, the Republic would resume peaceful governance without addressing how millions of accelerated aging veterans would assimilate into society. This omission reflected the Order's increasing alignment with short-term political demands, rather than with their historical responsibility to safeguard life and justice across the Republic. The reliance on the clone army also exposed the Jedi to vulnerabilities they failed to anticipate. By integrating themselves into chain of command structures built upon engineered obedience, the Order placed itself within a system it did not control. The Jedi accepted the clones' loyalty as a functional certainty without investigating whether that loyalty was natural or coerced. Their lack of inquiry into the clones' behavioral conditioning or biological design created a blind spot that Palpatine exploited. The Jedi assumed mutual respect formed the basis of their relationship with the clones, yet they never examined whether that respect originated from choice or from programming. This oversight demonstrated the Order's shift toward operational trust without analytical verification. The Jedi's misinterpretation of Order 66 further highlighted their misunderstanding of the clones' structural position within the war. When the clones executed the command, the Jedi viewed the event as betrayal rather than as the activation of a predetermined failsafe embedded into clone biology. This reaction revealed that the Order had never investigated the possibility of external control mechanisms within the clone design. Their assumption that interpersonal rapport equated to autonomous loyalty blinded them to the engineered nature of the army. The tragedy that followed illustrated the depth of their institutional failure, as the clones were subjected to programming that neither they nor the Jedi understood. The result was not an act of treachery, but a demonstration of systemic manipulation that the Order failed to detect. The role of the Jedi Council in managing the war emphasized how deeply they had integrated themselves into the Republic's military apparatus. Their participation in tactical planning, deployment cycles, and reinforcement allocation pushed them into positions traditionally held by career officers. This shift replaced their philosophical responsibilities with administrative ones, leaving little room for reflection on the ethical implications of commanding an army created through artificial means. Instead of challenging the Republic's reliance on manufactured soldiers, the Council accepted its necessity and directed operations accordingly. This decision normalized the clones' status as expendable assets, whose purpose was defined by conflict rather than by personal agency. The transition from Republic to Empire demonstrated that the ethical questions the Jedi had avoided became consequential in the post-war era. Without a framework that defined clones as persons, the Empire encountered no resistance when marginalizing them. The Jedi had spent years working alongside clones without establishing mechanisms to preserve their dignity or protect their future. Their assumption that the Republic's institutions would naturally provide for veterans proved unfounded, as those institutions were either dismantled or repurposed. The absence of long-term planning became a structural failure that left clones unprotected against systemic neglect. The portrayal of individual clones after the war reveals the extent of this institutional void. Many found themselves performing security duties, labour assignments, or administrative tasks within the Empire, often without clarity about their legal standing. Accelerated aging reduced their functional lifespan, yet no provisions existed to address their medical needs, or to support them as they became physically incapable of service. The Jedi's failure to question the ethics of accelerated aging during the war meant that the issue carried into the post-war period without policy intervention. As a result, clones aged out of service without established medical care, legal identity, or social integration pathways. The narrative arcs of clones who resisted the Empire further illustrated the consequences of the lack of institutional advocacy. Individuals who attempted to oppose imperial directives or escape decommissioning did so without support networks or legal standing. Their resistance required evasion, secrecy, and improvisation because no legitimate political structures acknowledged their autonomy. The absence of Jedi leadership during this period underscored how deeply clones had relied on an institution that had not prepared for their independence. The clones who attempted to assert agency in the aftermath found themselves operating in a political environment that had no place for them, reinforcing the extent to which they had been systemically excluded from citizenship. The Republic's administrative transition into imperial authority highlighted how the clones' legal identity had always been ambiguous. Throughout the war, they existed as military property, under the jurisdiction of the Senate and the oversight of the Jedi. Once the Jedi fell, the administrative foundation of clone identity reverted entirely to the control of the Empire. Without constitutional protections, clones became subject to repurposing, termination, or reassignment at the discretion of a regime that valued efficiency over welfare. This outcome was not an abrupt shift, but the continuation of conditions established during the war, demonstrating how the absence of Jedi advocacy shaped the policies that followed. The perception of clones within the galaxy also reflected the consequences of the Jedi's wartime decisions. While the Jedi were remembered as victims of a political coup, the clones were remembered as instruments of that event, despite their lack of agency. Their actions during Order 66 were widely interpreted as betrayal, yet no institutional effort existed to recontextualize their role or to communicate the reality of their programming to the public. With no Jedi remaining to clarify the truth, the clones were left carrying the stigma of treachery. This public perception further isolated them from civilian society, limiting their opportunities for reintegration and reinforcing their status as disposable elements of a discarded military system. The structural divide between Jedi philosophy and wartime practice became more apparent when examining the conditions clones faced after the conflict. The Order had relied on detachment as a means of maintaining internal balance, yet this principle prevented them from forming the attachment-based support systems that could have recognized clone trauma or advocated for clone rights. The Jedi's limited understanding of interpersonal bonds prevented them from developing frameworks for the psychological well-being of their soldiers. After the war, this absence of support translated directly into the clones' isolation, as no institutional mechanisms existed to address their emotional or mental needs. The Empire's rapid replacement of clone troops with conscripted forces further demonstrated the disposability inherent in their design. Accelerated aging, diminished political relevance, and the lack of citizenship allowed the Empire to phase out clones without resistance. The Jedi had fought alongside these soldiers for years, yet their absence during this transition revealed how little structural influence they had exerted to secure clone futures. Had the Order engaged in political advocacy, legislative reform, or ethical inquiry during the war, the clones might have entered the post-war period with recognized status. Instead, their existence was defined by utility, and once that utility expired, no institutional forces remained to defend their place in the galaxy. The cumulative effect of these post-war developments illustrates that the Jedi's failure to recognize the clones as individuals during the war created the conditions for their marginalization afterward. Their lack of inquiry into clone autonomy, accelerated aging, behavioral conditioning, and future integration created a systemic void that the Empire exploited with ease. The aftermath of the Clone Wars demonstrated that the clones' downfall did not originate solely from Imperial policy, but from the structural weaknesses left unaddressed by the Jedi. Without rights, advocacy, or institutional protection, the clones entered the post-war era as remnants of a conflict that had consumed their lives without preparing them for what followed. Taken together, the post-war experiences of the clones reveal how deeply the Jedi's wartime decisions shaped their fate, or Tiawa. The Order's failure to establish ethical guidelines, legal protections, or long-term planning left clones vulnerable to exploitation, erasure, and neglect. Their loyalty, service, and sacrifice were absorbed into a political system that never recognized them as autonomous beings. In the end, the Jedi did not merely fail to prevent their own downfall, they failed to safeguard the soldiers who had depended on them. The aftermath of the Clone Wars proved that the deepest consequence of the Jedi's choices was not only the collapse of their order, but the abandonment of the army they had commanded without understanding or
Thank you for
protecting its
watching.
humanity.
Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.